Hey BookTube. So I watched recently two BookTube videos, one by Brian at Bookish, and also a sort of response by my Grix. And you can check out their channels. I'll try to link to their videos below. But they both did videos on 10 big books that you don't have to read. But Grix changed his up a little bit and did 10 big books that he wants to read, but you don't have to. Well, Bookish's Brian at Bookish's video was just 10 big books that he's read, but he doesn't think you don't have to unless you're interested. So because usually people have this idea of, there's this list of books where they feel like they have to read, and especially if you're into older and more classical works where they feel like you have to try them at least once in your life. Grix went off the board more with his, and he chose a lot of big books that he would want to read, even if you don't have to. And so I thought that was a great idea, and I went through my shelves and I picked out 10 books to follow along Grix's line, where I picked out 10 books 10 hard books that I don't think you have to read, but I want to read, and I certainly will be reading them, or at least trying. And I have big stacks on each side of my camera, and I'll get into it. Starting off with a whopping 1,300 pages, The Tale of Genji. And The Tale of Genji is a bit of an infamous book, at least from what I can tell on BookTube, because it's so massive, and because of the very structure of the book. I've heard a lot of people have DNF'd this book, which means did not finish. And considering how long it is, and considering how the book is largely plotless, from what I understand, it really makes sense why this defeats a lot of people. But all the same, I'm very, very interested and very intrigued, especially why Steve Donahue considers this to be one of his favorite novels. And he seems to, he really, really loves it. Like, not just, considers it a great work, it's a deep love for him. And from what I know about this book, it's written like 1,000 years ago in ancient Japan, and it's just following the going-ons of a high Japanese court, and a certain figure named Genji. I believe it's a certain character named Genji, who and all his escapades in his society and in his high rank. And another notorious part of this book that I've heard is that the names can be very opaque, especially in different translations, because they're apparently in the original she does not actually name people; she gives them their title, and so trying to track certain characters can be difficult if they're given the same title, or their title changes. And so, especially if you read this in a different translation, or different, because this is the Norton translation by Dennis Washburn. And if you notice, there's also a Open Letters Monthly review blurb on the back. And if you know, then you know who that's from. And even though it's 1,300 pages, I've always had a sweet spot for really large books and books that are considered challenging, and this is right up my alley, it seems like, and I hope I don't get bored. But even if I did, I think I would still plow through, because I want to experience this to its fullest, and getting bored during a book when I'm reading it doesn't really deter me. I still keep on reading, and I hope to finish this. I don't know when, but I hope to finish it. And moving on to the next one, I have them separated rather in roughly fiction to roughly nonfiction, though it isn't as neat as I thought it would be. And this next work is 3 volumes. 3 volumes. You might think that it's the same 3 volumes from Grix when you see that it's 3 Penguin volumes, but as you see with that picture there, this is actually the 3-volume Penguin translation of The Arabian Nights, Tales of 1001 Nights. And this is the complete 3 volumes from Penguin. We get, this is volume 1, that cover. We got volume 2 and volume 3. And this translation is done by Malcolm C. Lyons and Ursula Lyons. And this is a fairly modern translation. I believe this was translated, 2008. For a big project like this, that's fairly recent. And I've had this on my shelf for quite a while, and it really, really interests me because just how influential the tales are. And you see volumes, abridged volumes, all the time, like even big bricks of a thing, like where they can be 1,000 pages. But this is the full, complete work of at least one manuscript tradition. There's like all old works. There's multiple manuscript traditions, and this is based off of a certain manuscript. So even some like nerdy scholars would consider this incomplete. And I've flipped through this. I have not actually started reading this, but I've gone through it, and they actually have included some famous tales that were not part of this main manuscript, and they included them in the very back. Like the famous story of Aladdin, which Disney made a film out of, is not actually part of this normal manuscript tradition, because as the manuscript goes through time and is copied down, people will add more stories. You get something like that in the Bible, where you have, or in the New Testament, and where you have scribes who will add their own line or add a couple of verses, or they will be translated differently. In the Arabian Nights, a lot of the famous tales show up later in manuscript editions, and so they didn't actually make it into the original 3 volumes. So they at the very back of volume 3, they include those, you can call them apocrypha, Arabian Night translation or stories, and I find that really interesting, and it's very compelling. And this is not even the first 3-volume, or at least complete Arabian Nights in English. There's a one that's 100 years old. You can find it in public domain, and I believe it's Richard Burton, something like that. He was an explorer, a famous Victorian explorer, and they actually mention him in the introduction, where they say that his translation is a classic. But yeah, Richard Burton, his famous translation from 1885 to 1888. They call it a great achievement in its time. Burton's translation nonetheless contains many errors, and even his 1880s English read strangely. So, over 100 years later, you get an update. There's that one. Next is another novel, and this is Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann is a bit of an interesting author for me. I've read one of his novels, and I've read a lot of his short stories, including his famous Death in Venice. I loved his Death in Venice when the first time I read it, and I have not reread it since, but I really, really need to, because I've forgotten why I loved it, even though I still remember the story. And it's only like 70 pages, so it shouldn't take that long to read. But I do remember Thomas Mann being more of a complex, slow writer, where he builds his stories up. He's not giving you like a quick impression in his short stories or in his novels. He's really, he's very, I don't know how else to explain that. He's a dense author, but he's not so dense that you don't understand him, if that makes any sense. So I've read his novel, Dr. Faustus, and I believe that was a wrong place to start for his novels, because I loved his short stories, and then I really was excited to get into his novels, and I read Dr. Faustus, and that was very dense and very, very difficult. I did not understand a lot that was going on in that novel, even though I did enjoy it because it was Thomas Mann. So this year I'm hoping to read his uh, Magic Mountain, but here I have his Joseph and His Brothers, which is actually a collection of novels that runs all the way to just just about 1,500 pages, and it's basically 4 books. And this is a new translation by John E. Woods in the Everyman's Library edition, and yeah, includes the stories of Jacob, young Joseph, Joseph in Egypt, and Joseph the provider. And as you probably guessed, this is his take on the biblical story Genesis, and that's what I first got as my impression. But as I've heard other people talk about this book, and as I've dipped in and out, I haven't read large chunks, but I've explored, and I've also read the very short introduction provided by the translator, because the translator says something really weird. He says he does not recommend you start at the very beginning. He recommends you start well over 100 or so pages into the book, because Thomas Mann spends the first 50 or 70 pages actually making his own take on the beginning of Genesis. So it's like a philosophical pastiche of Genesis, and that can throw a lot of readers off. And so the translator says he recommends that you read this. You start with the actual story, where we actually start following Joseph and his brothers, or Jacob. And yeah, because look here, listen to this first line. Deep is the well of the past. Should we not call it bottomless? Indeed, if we should, if in fact, perhaps only if, the past subjected to our remarks and inquiries is solely that of humanity, and of this enigmatic life form that compromises our own naturally lusty and preternaturally wretched existence, and whose mystery is quite understandably the alpha and omega of all our remarks and inquiries, leading urgency and fire to all our speech, insistencies to all our questions. You see how philosophical and dense that is? Because the author is immediately posing questions, and he doesn't introduce anyone except for some ideas, which is not usually how you start a novel. And so I really want to read this, but before I do that, I would like to reread chunks of the New Testament and the Old Testament, because from what I understand, Thomas Mann is pulling in a lot from the Bible into this, obviously. Not just because of the title story of Joseph and his brothers, but just pulling from all aspects of the Bible and just mixing it together into his own story. And that fascinates me, and I want to be able to follow along with all his biblical references and understandings. Like, for example, the Alpha and Omega that I just read. If you don't know the beginning of Revelations, the book of Revelations, where it says, "I'm the Alpha and the Omega," which is a reference to something Jesus said in the book of Revelations. Anyways, enough blabbering about that. Next is another novel. This is a novel I've talked about on my channel before, I believe when I hauled it like a year ago. We got The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell. And the reason why this is a hard book is, well, not only is it a big chunkster. How long is this? Almost 1,000 pages. Not quite. It's about 975. And it's a pretty big, hefty hardcover. But not only is it a really long novel, but it's also a very controversial novel. From what I understand, this novel takes the perspective of a former Nazi soldier who was like a high up in Hitler's regime. So he was involved with all of the disgusting and morally reprehensible aspects of the Nazi regime. And he writes, and this book is written from his perspective, trying to not only trying to explain himself, but also describes everything that goes on. So in these pages, you get a lot of torture and a lot of brutal treatment of humanity, and just a lot of evil is in these pages. And you get it from someone who's telling their own perspective, so it's in first person. And so you're basically taking on the mind of this reprehensible Nazi figure for almost 1,000 pages. And from what I understand, I found this at a thrift store, and I've heard Steve Donahue talk about it, but from what I've got, so I wasn't around or wasn't seriously reading books when this book came out in 2009, but from what I understand, this was when this came out in America, or in the English-speaking market, it was received quite lukewarmly because uh, because of the brutality, and it didn't really, it had a lot of moral ambiguity to it, which is not something that you would want in something like this from the perspective of a Nazi, or a former Nazi, uh, you know, perpetrator. And though this was highly praised in French when it first came out, because this was published in French in France first before it came over to America, despite the author actually being an American. And that's The Kindly Ones. This one really has tempted me because I don't know, I'm sickly fascinated by it. And I don't think I'd get queasy reading it, even if he does get really explicit in some of his details. But I want to see what he does with it, and if the outrage was justified. And I believe it was Steve that said that there were large sections of this book that are actually brilliant. So we'll see. I believe that's it actually for fiction. So now we move on to a lot of non-fiction. Though this next book is it's non-fiction about fiction. So it's the novel biography by Michael Schmidt. Is it Schmid? Schmidt? The novel. And this is a big fat hardcover of exactly what the title says. Well, about the novel. This is a book that's about books. It literally, him going through author by author, just discussing books, or authors and their books. Like if you see the table of contents, he lists roughly by theme, and he lists all the authors underneath that theme that he will discuss. So, like, so the first chapter is called Literature is Invention, and then he talks about some really old literature, so that wasn't a good example. Let's see if I go here at the very bottom. He has chapter 19 is called Thought Divers, where he talks about Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it just goes through that for 1,100 pages. And as you can tell, this book is larger than your average hardcover. Like if I take Thomas Mann, and you can roughly line it up, this is a lot wider as a hardcover, and it's also quite heavy. Like it is very heavy to hold, and I don't know how comfortable this will be to read, especially for 1,100 pages. But I picked it up because it's a very literary work, where he's just talking about all these authors that he's read, and all these authors that he's loved, and discussing their work all together. And he's got all his ideas, just put him into this book called The Novel. And I think the subtitle, A Biography, is rather misleading, because like, how can you write a biography of the novel? And he's not really tracking the development of the novel, from what I understand at least. He might be doing that, but I don't get that impression. It's more just him doing a lot of reading and thinking about that reading, and writing about it in this big book. And the thing is, if you are aware, Michael Schmidt actually wrote another book like this from 1999, I believe. It's called The Lives of the Poets, and it's a 1,000-page brick on poets, which is exactly this model on poetry. Yeah, but just on poetry. And then this book came out, I believe, in 2014. So within 15 years, he had done enough reading to actually, I can't seem to find the page, but yeah, so this is from 2014, I believe, but yeah, it's 1100 pages of just him writing about books. And usually people want to spend those 1100 pages reading books, like reading actual novels, instead of reading someone who's talking about novels. But here I am with this book. It's quite expensive. I believe I bought this, it was $50. I hope it's worth it. And you don't have to read it, but I am. I'm very interested. And now we get into some more difficult works, more non-fiction. And as you see, this is another Penguin. This is St. Augustine's City of God. This is a Penguin edition. As you can see, it's another big, fat book. So, this book is notorious for being a difficult book. Usually everyone reads his Confessions, because that's short and more accessible, I want to say, even though I haven't read it myself. But The City of God is a book that has really tempted me because of the subject matter, and also I was inspired from Steve Donahue's video on St. Augustine for his March of the Penguins all those years ago. I was following them as they came out, and I remember the very first video was on St. Augustine's Confessions, and he just spoke about this book as the smartest mind of his day, trying to come to grips to a tragedy, and so he's taking all of his secular and all his theological knowledge and trying to grapple with the fall of Rome and or at least the actual barbarian takeover of Rome at the time. And so what Saint Augustine is doing is he's saying that even if Rome is taken over, which is the city of the Vatican, even if Rome is taken over, it doesn't just take away from God's glory, because God's glory is based in the city of God, not in, or at least in the heavenly sphere, so a heavenly city, not on a physical actual city. So Rome could be flattened, and it wouldn't diminish God's light in the world. And he goes on for, yeah, well over 1,000 pages, almost 1,100 pages, talking about that very thing. So as you imagine, this book is full of not only Christian references, so a lot of the Bible, and I guess other Christians that came before him, St. Augustine, but also a lot of Roman literature and Roman poetry and Roman writing, like Cicero, and also the Neoplatonists, because that's St. Augustine was very much influenced by the Neoplatonists. So it's basically a catch-all book of him just thinking about these religious issues and political issues of his time. And so yeah, I don't know how many people can read 1,100 pages of that, or would want to. They might see that as torture, but I'm perfectly fine with it. I find it exciting. I'm going to pause this for a second. Okay, I'm back. I just wanted to get a little bit more light from the lamp here, as my books were blocking it. And the next book, as you probably saw, The Aeneids by Plotinus. And this is a relatively modern edition, translated by George Boyce Stones, John M. Dillon, Lloyd P. Garrison, R.A.H. King, Andrew Smith, and James Wilberding. That's a lot of translators for this book. And if you're not familiar at all with Plotinus or the Aeneids, this is Plotinus was a 2nd century Greek religious figure, or Greek religious writer and philosopher. And if you've heard of the Neoplatonists. Plotinus was considered the last great pagan Neoplatonist, and which is like Plato's ideas, but reformed and rethought through and reconsidered throughout uh, since the time of Plato to, first or second A.D. when you have the beginning of Christian influence. So Christian theology and Christian thought really took off of a lot of Neoplatonist ideas, which, going back to St. Augustine, he was very much influenced by those very figures. So, and the Aeneid and Plotinus is one of the most famous ones of the Neoplatonist school, and he's also considered the last non-Christian person of, or at least of significance, of that school of thought. And basically, it's 800 books, or not 800 pages, or 900 pages of him just going through spiritual and philosophical ideas that relate to reality and relate to the soul and to how the world works. And what makes this book especially difficult is that it was not actually compiled in order. I don't know if you can see that, but what this book does is they print it as the manuscript tradition has come down to us, but we also have, but we know that this book was reformulated early on by Plotinus's own, what would you say, his understudy or his protege? When Plotinus died, his protege, whose name escapes me, but yeah, Porphyry. I think that, I don't know, Prof, and then Y-R-Y. Porphyry. So, once Plotinus dies, Porphyry takes all his writings, Plotinus's writings, and puts them into this book. But he admits himself that he didn't put them in order. It was more, and so what this book does is it puts the order in as Porphyry put them in, because that's how we know the book today. But they also include, if you should see, in brackets, there's a number there, and that's 40. That means that's the actual proper order of the book. So if I were to read this from 1 till whatever the last number is, I'd be starting in the middle of the book, I'd be jumping to here, to here, to here, to here. If I want to read the presumably what the actual order is that Plotinus wrote this book. I don't know the rationale for why the order was switched up. Maybe it's by subject matter. I don't know. I have not read this book. But I know that it's very difficult and a dense book to get through. Because it's, it's a book of philosophy. So philosophy and theological discussions mix. So of course it's going to be very dense. And so that's what this book is. Moving on, I know I'm getting quite long here. The next book is actually a 3-volume work that I have, and can you guess what this 3-volume work is? Nope, it's not the same one that Grix had either. It's the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn? But anyways, this is his famous Gulag Archipelago, where in 3 volumes, he basically exposes, but also wrestles with, what all happens in the Russian gulags during the Soviet Union. And he himself was a Soviet soldier who was put in the gulags, and the experiences of being in the gulags and incorporating the experiences of other people and all the stories and whatnot. He basically compiled into this big 3-volume work. And I believe this is the only English translation. I don't think there's any other translation. And I did look to see if there was a big 1-volume, but I couldn't find it. And so I swallowed and just spent $30 per book. So yeah, this was quite expensive to buy, and but they're well-made paperbacks. But as you can see, that's volume one with like a reddish pinkish cover, which itself is quite long. Yeah, over 600 pages in that volume. And then we got volume 2, which with a black cover, which is a bit shorter. And then we got volume 3 with a white cover. But they all incorporate all the other colors. So we got some black and some white and some pink. And I'm quite looking forward to that, even though I know it's a difficult book, because similar to the Kindly ones, but not in the same way, because this is nonfiction. So this is actually real. This is what happened. He is talking about a lot of human brutality and a lot of human suffering, but he has a lot of very interesting realizations and very interesting human insight and a lot of wisdom that he comes out with, because there's a lot of soul searching that goes on in these books as well. I'm saying this from what I've heard from other people and a little bit of what I've read about this book myself. I have not actually started these books, but if you can't tell, I do like to research my books quite a lot, and I'm curious about them and knowing why they're influential, because that's why I picked this up. I'm not going to spend a ton of money on just a chance that these would be terrible to read. They're classics for a reason. Classics of the 20th century for a reason. So that's the Gulag Archipelago. It's not for everyone, because I don't blame people if they don't want to read that kind of brutal experiences for over 1,300 pages or so. Next is another nonfiction. This is The House of Government, a saga of the Russian Revolution by Yuri Slezkin. And as you can see, another hardcover and another big book. This is actually the most recent book on this list. This is from 2017, and this is from what I can understand. Yeah, this is 1,000 pages for sure. And from what I understand, this is a book that follows the story of a massive apartment block in the Soviet Union. I don't know if it's in St. Petersburg or if it's in Moscow, but either way, this apartment block held a lot of important people during the Soviet Union, or during the Russian Revolution, not the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, and it follows apartment by apartment all the people that were in that apartment and what happened to them, what their fates were, and in a way that how that reflects on the experience of the Russian Revolution and maybe the Soviet Union as a whole. And that's my impressions that I get from it. Like, as you see with this cover here, you get different apartment blocks or different apartments. And so I believe that's what he does. I'm not entirely sure exactly how he does that, but I just know that this was heavily praised when it came out, also by Steve Donahue, but by others as well, because despite it being so thick, this book apparently is very well written and just a fascinating look at the Soviet regime and the Russian Revolution as a experience. So this is on my list, and as you can tell, this is more brutal history, and not everyone is going to want to read. I mean, not everyone reads history to begin with, but 1,000 pages of this kind of history, especially if you don't see how the relevance of a apartment block has to do with anything, you wouldn't be willing to take a flyer on this if you didn't know anything about it, or if you hadn't come recommended by anyone that whose opinion you trusted. What's sad though is that, as you can tell too, my hardcover I found used for very cheap, and when it comes to used books, I had to compromise because there's only this one used copy there. It's kind of falling apart. As right there, this front, there's a weak spot right there where I believe it's only held by one page onto the actual block here, or else the book would unfold. But I'm quite careful with my books, so despite, as you can see with that over there, that shouldn't be a problem when I read this. But it is quite heavy, so I will have to be careful. We're on to the last book, and at 35 minutes, good lord. 35 minutes, we got the grand finale. This book would almost certainly be on no one else's list, unless you're crazy, and unless you're smarter than I am, because I don't know how much I'll actually comprehend from this book, but I'm very excited for it. And this is Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. And as you see, common theme, thick book. This book, though, is not as long as all the other ones. This one's less than 800 pages. But there's a lot going into this book. One, Charles Taylor is a philosopher that I really find him interesting and fascinating. I've not actually read a full book of his, but I've watched a lot of his lectures online, and I know a lot of other people who I've read and who I find interesting, who are very much influenced by Charles Taylor. If you don't know who Charles Taylor is, he is a Canadian philosopher, but who's very highly lauded, like a very well-praised philosopher in the continental tradition. So if you know your philosophy designations, he's a continental philosopher, and which means he doesn't deal in very precise, like analytical reasoning. He's more of a big overall picture thinker. And so some of his other books I would like to read are his Sources of the Self, which came out in like the late 80s. And then I also have another book of his on the shelf here somewhere, which is a very thin thing, which is based on a lecture series that he did, and I listened to most of those lectures. But this book came out in 2007, and it's his philosophy of sociology. Yes, that is an actual discipline, even though he's not like a formally trained in that discipline. It's just what you would designate this book, what it's trying to do. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to take that concept of the secular or the fact that we live in a secular age, which is, and as most people would define it, as an age in which spirituality or religion is going on a drastic downcline, and how that's affecting every aspect of our lives today. And he wants to study that. He wants to see, like, is that really true? But not only is that really true, how did we get there? And this is what this book tries to do. Because he's so well read, not only in philosophy but in literature and in history, he takes like an approach where he's pulling in from all his knowledge from that he's read and his previous ideas that he's articulated in other books, and just brings them together into this focus of secularization in this modern age. And what does that actually mean? Because I don't have it here, but I have a thin book by James K.A. Smith, which is a Protestant philosopher, which is called How Not to Be Secular, which is an actual book, a little tiny, like 160-page book summarizing the major ideas from this book, so that he can have other like religious people read it, because this book basically dropped a bomb in religious circles, at least in more well-read, more intellectual religious circles, because a lot of his ideas in here are quite novel and quite very interesting, very thought-provoking, and very influential, especially in sociology of religion, or philosophy of religion, or any look at secularization will have to contend with this book. And those are ideas that all very fascinate me, and I don't expect them to fascinate you, so I won't go on for much longer, considering I'm almost at 40 minutes. So, A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, and yeah, that's about it. That's my list. So I'll make sure to leave the link to those videos that I talked about below, and I would love to see anyone else make a video like this. What big books that hard books that you would like to read, but you don't expect anyone else want to read them. Let me know. Okay. Have a good day, good evening, BookTube.